On the admin page of the application, we're displaying the employee rating. Presumably a 1 is the worst rating and a 5 is the highest rating. But what I'd like to do here is display a series of stars like you would see on some reviews website, instead of just displaying a number. And I'd also like to give the user the ability to click here to increase the rating of an employee. Click until we reach the maximum rating and then loop around back to the worst rating. And I don't want to implement this by adding that capability to this admin template in my admin controller. I'd much rather encapsulate this inside of a custom directive. And the way I usually start writing a custom directive is just like I write any other class or function. I typically try to write what I would like to see and then see if I can make that work. So I would like a custom directive rating. I'd like to specify some sort of expression like employee.rating to set the value for that rating. Is it a 1? Is it a 4? Is it a 5? And it might also be necessary to specify what the minimum and maximum rating will be. So that's what I would like to see. Unfortunately, Angular UI already has a directive called rating. So this actually isn't something that you would need to build yourself, but we're still going to do it because it's an interesting exercise. But it does mean that my directive rating would conflict with Angular UI's directive named rating. And that's why quite commonly you'll see people namespace prefix their directives. So I'm going to call this OTF-rating. And that just means when I declare my rating, the function that returns the directive definition object, I'm going to call this OTF rating. But instead of using a dash in the name, I will have a capital letter. And that's the naming convention for Angular directives. Replace a capital letter with a lowercase letter, but also put a dash in front. And from inside this directive, what I need to do is I need the ability to evaluate this expression. I need to know what the employee's rating is. And one of the easiest ways to do that is to set up an isolated scope. And in this case, my isolated scope, I'm going to say that I want a property value, and I want it bound using two-way binding, using the expression that is in the attribute of the same name as of this property. So my property is named value. In the HTML, there's an attribute value. There's an expression here. Angular is going to keep employee.rating in sync with the value property on my scope object. Now, this is the imperative approach to writing this directive. I think this is the hard way to do it, but I'm doing this to demonstrate some common tips and tricks I've learned for writing linking functions. We all know that linking functions take the scope object, the directive element, and the attributes that are on that element. And when you first get started writing directives, it's quite common to want to jump in here in the linking function and start doing things with the element right away. So eventually what I want to do is I want to start appending HTML to my element, some sort of HTML like the following that I'm going to paste in, which will place a button into the element. That button has a span inside that basically has an icon or a star. And we would want to append 1 star for each rating point that someone has. So if value is 4, we would want 4 stars. So we might put this inside of a loop. But this is a common error I see. What you really want to do is you want to wrap capabilities like that inside of a watch. Because scope.value has this essentially two-way binding between your scope and the expression that your consumer has provided, then the value can change. So we want to watch that value and react when it changes. And we can do that with a watch, which will tell Angular to call this function we've provided anytime the value changes, and we will get the new value here. And it's inside of here where we can make sure we empty out our element, just in case we had previously placed stars in the element and now it's changing. And then we could set up a loop. So for I is 0 to less than new value and increment I each time, let me paste in the code that I just had, which is appending a button with a star inside. And let's take a quick peek at how this looks. If I save everything, refresh my UI, I now have stars for each rating point. These aren't the prettiest stars. We'll improve this later. But I do have the stars, and now if I click, I want the ability to increase that rating. Increase it to the maximum value and then wrap around. And that means I will need to know the minimum and maximum values. What's the best way to get these values? Well, I could set up bindings on my isolated scope, but presumably these values don't change while the application is running. They're sort of business logic constants. So what I might do instead is just pick them out of elements. And I'm going to need to parse them because everything provided through attributes will be provided as a string. So I'm going to need to say attributes.min and perhaps provide a default value here. If you didn't specify a minimum value, we'll specify a minimum value of 1. And I also need to parse int on attributes.max. And let's make the default value there 10. So now I know the minimum and maximum. Now I just need to know when the user clicks on my element or a child of my element. And that's easy enough to do using element.on. That allows me to wire up event handlers. So anytime this element is clicked on, we want to execute the following code. Now I'm going to put a common flaw into this code, and we'll see what the flaw is in just a moment. Inside of here, I just basically need the logic to say if scope.value is less than the maximum value for the rating, then let's increment scope.value. And because I have a binding expression here, Angular will keep that in sync with my parent. Otherwise, I want to wrap around and say scope.value equals the minimum available value. Now let's take a look at what happens when I run this in the UI. I'm going to do a refresh. I'm going to click on myself a couple times, and I notice the rating is not increasing. But just for the fun of it, let's go out and promote somebody. And now notice my rating has increased. And that's because of something that I forgot to do inside of element.on. I've seen this happen many times, but whenever you say, I'm changing a model value, but the UI isn't updating, that usually means you're changing a model value behind Angular's back. You're doing that because you are wiring up to a native DOM event, or you are in some way executing code that Angular doesn't know that you're executing that code. Therefore, it doesn't run its digest phase and try to detect changes on the model. The proper way to tell Angular that you are about to execute code that's going to change the model is to use scope.apply and pass in a function which represents your logic. So I just want to take what I had before and wrap it inside of an apply. I need to do that because I'm going directly to this click event. I'm wiring up a native DOM event. I'm not doing it through ng-click, which would handle this for me. But now if I save everything and come back to the UI and refresh, I now have stars that represent the rating value, and I should now be able to click to increase the number of stars, and that should wrap around to 1 once we reach the maximum. So that's all good and working, but I've really done this, I think, the hard way, by writing most of my code inside of a linking function. And I did that primarily to give you the 2 tips of using scope.apply when you are reacting to an event, and using scope.watch to make sure you are modifying the DOM when a model value changes. But in the next clip, let's look at an easier approach to building this, a more declarative approach.